The Rules Committee will come to order. Today, we're going to consider 4 measures to bolster public safety nationwide. Representative Katie Porter's bill, H.R. 8542, the Mental Health Justice Act of 2022, would create a grant program for states and local governments to train and dispatch mental health professionals to respond to emergencies that involve people with behavioral health needs. Representative Val Deming's bill, H.R. 5768, the Victim Act of 2022, would establish a grant program to hire, train, and retain detectives and victim services personnel to investigate shootings and support victims. Representative Stephen Horsford's bill, H.R. 4118, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, would provide grants to communities for evidence-based community violence intervention and prevention programs designed to interrupt cycles of violence. And finally, Representative Josh Gottheimer's bill, H.R. 6448, the Invest to Protect Act of 2022, would provide local police departments with resources to improve officer training for calls involving people with substance use disorders, mental health needs, or people with disabilities. It also provides safety training for calls involving veterans, vulnerable youth, victims of domestic violence, and people living in poverty. Each offers important ideas that could benefit the safety and security of the American people. These bills represent a lot of hard work. I want to recognize the many individuals who put time into making this happen. The bill sponsors, the Judiciary and Energy and Commerce Committees, as well as our leadership, the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus for their work to get this across the finish line. I'm sure there'll be some discussion on these measures today, and so I will turn this over now to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any statements he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're here meeting today on 4 pieces of legislation that were previously noticed for the end of July. An hour ago, we learned that we would be meeting on them today. Some of these bills have been modified, I assume, to address the concerns of left-wing activists, the same individuals who have spent the past months championing the damaging defund the police rhetoric. While I'm concerned that the Democratic majority may have weakened the areas which originally resulted in bipartisan support, I hope at least some of these bills we can find bipartisan support and move them forward. Make no mistake, however, even if some of these bills receive bipartisan support, the reason we're here today, meeting under emergency designation, is an attempt for the majority to paper over the constant calls over the last few years from some Democrats to enact a radical defund the police agenda. Having spent the last 2 years bashing police departments at every turn and embracing loud voices within their own caucus who sought to defund the police, the majority has obviously realized that these positions are politically untenable. In a last-ditch effort to protect vulnerable members of their razor-thin majority, Democrats are now bringing up these bills, hoping that the fig leaf will hide their long-standing support for defunding the police and cover up years of extremely damaging rhetoric. While it's better late than never, I do not think the American people will forget what the majority's been saying all along, constantly demonizing those public servants who protect us from criminals and actively trying to cut police funding was and is tremendously destructive. Today's bills cannot make up for that. It cannot make up for lost time, for years spent demonizing police, even while crime has spiraled out of control in our cities. Make no mistake, I'm in favor of increasing funding for police departments across the country. I simply find it astonishing that the majority is so abruptly changing their tune now at this moment when it's politically expedient to do so. Having unleashed forces they could not control all across the country, the majority is now trying to put the proverbial genie back in the bottle and pretend they were never in favor of defunding the police. But I do not think that will be successful. Too many radical progressive Democrats have too vocally called for defunding the police for too long, and the results have been disastrous. Having sown, the majority now must reap and must face the consequences for what they've done. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the gentleman's opening statement, and I just want to say for the record that it is not Democrats who are calling for the defunding of the FBI in this Congress. But in any event, I want to welcome our 2 witnesses here, Ms. Jackson Lee and Mr. Tiffany. We're delighted that you're here. You will provide testimony on the Mental Health Justice Act, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, the Victim Act, and the Invest to Protect Act. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Well, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, let me thank you and the Rules Committee for its expeditious handling of these very crucial matters. People suffer as we do not push or move on legislation, and we thank you for convening this Rules Committee. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of this policing package that we're bringing forward today. The three bills in the jurisdiction of the House Judiciary are H.R. 4118, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, H.R. 5768, the Violent Incident Clearance and Technological Investigative Methods of 2022, or Victim Act, and H.R. 6448, the Invest to Protect Act of 2022. As communities across the country continue to face increased gun violence, homicides, and other violent crime, I'm pleased to bring forward three bills that are vital steps toward reducing community violence, improving clearance rates for violent crime, and increasing public safety overall. Certainly, we are also concerned about ensuring mental health support as well. H.R. 4118, introduced by Representative Stephen Horsford, directs the Department of Labor to award $1.5 million in workforce development grants for youth in communities that are disproportionately impacted by violence, and directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to provide $5 million in grants for community violence intervention programs over 8 years. These programs include community outreach programs staffed by violence intervention specialists with ties to their communities, hospital-based violence intervention programs to provide intensive counseling, peer support, and social services, group violence intervention strategies that provide culturally responsive support and services, and violence interruption and crisis management initiatives that respond to and mediate potentially violent threats, violent conflicts, and provide support services where violence has already occurred, long overdue in our communities. While the human cost of gun violence is at times overwhelming, the economic cost for communities and taxpayers is also stunning. The total cost of gun violence is $280 billion every year, with every American bearing $700 of the cost annually as well. Because a single gun homicide costs taxpayers $448,000 in medical and criminal justice expenses, and we know that the community violence intervention programs have been shown to dramatically reduce rates of homicide and other gun violence by as much as 50%, and sometimes more. Representative Horsford's bill will save lives and taxpayer dollars. In addition, providing vital grant funding, H.R. 4118 would establish an Office of Community Violence Intervention within the Department of Health and Human Services to implement the act, and an advisory committee to assist and advise the office and select grantees. The next bill is in this package, H.R. 5768, the Victim Act, is bipartisan legislation that provides $100 million annually in grant funding to state, tribal, or local law enforcement agencies and prosecuting offices to bolster law enforcement agencies' ability to investigate and clear cases of homicide, rape, sexual assault, kidnapping, and non-fatal shootings. I think no one in our respective communities and in America would oppose that. Homicide clearance rates, in particular, have dropped consistently since the 1960s, leaving many unsolved cases and many victims and their families still searching for justice. In 2020, the clearance rate for homicides fell to about 50%. To address the challenges our law enforcement agencies are facing in solving homicides and other violent crime, this critical funding allows agencies to hire, train, and retain detectives and investigators to improve case clearance rates for such crimes. Low clearance rates, which disproportionately affect victims and families of victims who are poor, undereducated, unemployed, and Black or Hispanic, not only prevent victims from accessing justice, but they also damage the public's trust in law enforcement. That is why funding in the bill can be used to train personnel to address the needs of victims and family members and develop competitive and evidence-based programs and practices to improve clearance rates and victim services, thereby rebuilding public confidence and improving community safety. The bill also ensures victim services are funded, staffed, and trained, and that they provide restorative support to victims and their families. Investing in the personnel and technology needed to solve cases of homicide and other violent crime also helps build public confidence in law enforcement and improve community safety. H.R. 5768's funding can be used to acquire, upgrade, or replace investigative or evidence processing technology or equipment and train evidence processing personnel. The bill also requires the National Institute of Justice to conduct biannual evaluation of victim grants and practices implemented by grant recipients to identify policies and procedures that have successfully improved clearance rates. While the United States have experienced a substantial decline in homicides and violent crimes since rates peaked in the early 1990s, the number of homicides in 2021 in 27 major cities increased by 5% from 2020 and by 44% from 2019. Homicide rates also increased in rural communities by 25% in 2020, the largest increase since the CDC began tracking. This problem impacts every single community in the country, not respecting who is leading that particular community, what party is leading that particular community. By providing agencies with additional resources, the Victim Act equips agencies to better respond to and investigate these serious crimes, bringing justice for the victims and keeping our community safe. The third bill we are considering today, H.R. 6448 from the Judiciary Committee, the Invest to Protect Act of 2022. The Invest to Protect Act would bolster small law enforcement agencies' ability to address staffing shortages and improve community safety through de-escalation training and other resources. The bill would establish a grant program within the Department of Justice, Community-Oriented Policing Services, or COPS program, focused on improving recruitment and retention of officers and providing additional training and access to mental health resources for small law enforcement agencies, naturally at sometimes in small rural communities. When police departments or small cities, when police departments are unable to recruit, retain, and adequately resource qualified offenders, communities suffer a clear threat to public safety. A June 2021 national survey by the Police Executive Research Forum found that on average, police departments around the country were filling only 93% of available budgeted positions. These officer staffing shortages can cause longer wait times for emergency calls, fewer crimes cleared, and more overworked officers, which can threaten both officer health and the quality of life in our communities. This bill seeks to address those challenges by providing additional federal resources to small agencies to recruit and retain qualified officers, as well as provide additional training and support for these agencies. Importantly, H.R. 6448 includes limitations on the use of grant funds for hiring and retention to ensure that the funds are not misused, and requires an annual report to Congress on the signing and retention bonuses provided under the bill. The Department of Justice is also required to submit a report to Congress on the agency's plan to streamline the grant application process. This legislation includes grant auditing provisions to ensure funds are used appropriately. I thank the committee for listening attentively to the reporting of the three bills under our jurisdiction, and I encourage and hope to have the ability to answer your questions, and of course, to see these bills move forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tiffany. We're delighted that you are here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to give an alternative view of what we have before us, and it's good to see the ranking member here also. The collection of bills before us is a ploy to paper over Democrats' defund the police campaign. For more than 2 years, many Democrats embraced the defund the police movement. After seeing the dangerous results in their communities and how unpopular it is with Americans, some Democrats are now desperately trying to distance themselves from the defund the police movement. By the way, all you got to do is turn on your TV in any battleground state in America, and you'll see those ads that highlight the defund the police movement. But Democrats can't change what's already happened. While Democrat-run cities defunded police departments, this country experienced a spike in violent crime. In 2020, the United States tallied more than 20,000 murders, the highest total since 1995, 4,000 more than in 2019. For example, in New York City, the overall crime rate rose 11% in October 2021 compared to the year previous. This jump in crime continued after New York City defunded its police department by $1 billion. Likewise, Los Angeles County defunded its Police Department by $150 million, then saw homicides increase 23% between 2020 and 2021. Those are just two examples. There are many more. Right next to the west side of my district in Minneapolis, you've seen two beautiful cities that are now a war zone, Minneapolis and St. Paul. With Americans now seeing the dangerous results of the Democrats' defund the police rhetoric, some Democrats now claim they never wanted to defund the police, but their own words tell a different story. Chairman Nadler publicly agreed with reducing the NYPD budget, stating there should be substantial cuts to the police budget and a reallocation of those funds to where we need them. The Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security tweeted, "Defund the police, invest in our communities." These are just two prominent examples. There are more Democrats who push this reckless rhetoric and propped up a dangerous movement. And that is why we are here today to consider this slate of bills. I should also point out that only one of these bills went through regular order and was considered by the Judiciary Committee. Perhaps if the Democrats weren't in cleanup mode after their disastrous defund the police movement rhetoric over the last few years, the Committee of Jurisdiction could have had an opportunity to consider and improve these bills before they came to the floor. Instead, Democrats are rushing to consider these bills to give themselves some pretense that they support funding the police. But Americans know where Democrats really stand. They've seen 2 long years of Democrats embracing and supporting the radical defund the police movement. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the testimony that both of you have provided. Let me just say, for the record, I mean, if we want to cite quotes of people advocating defunding law enforcement, I could be here all day reciting the quotes of many Republicans in this chamber suggesting that we should defund the FBI. I could sit here all day and talk about the Republicans in this chamber who have consistently sided with those who attacked this Capitol building, where 140 Capitol police officers were injured. And we can go back and forth all day if you want to do that. But I guess the issue is whether or not these bills before us are helpful, whether or not they will help fight crime, whether they will help deal with some of the challenges that we're faced with. And if they are, we should support them. If people think that they're not, then you can vote against them. And I think these are pretty good bills. Most law enforcement that I talk to think that these bills are helpful. But if people have a different opinion, that's fine. But I think it's probably more constructive to talk about whether these bills are worth moving forward, rather than we can get back. Both sides can get into this war of, I know someone who said this and I know someone who said that. But we can do that if you want. But in any event, I think everybody's pretty clear on what they think of these bills. I don't know, Mr. Tiffany, do you oppose all these bills, or is it just you going to vote no on all these bills?
Yes, I oppose these
Okay,
bills.
so you're going to vote yes on all these bills?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. I think we're clear. Mr. Cole.
Well, to be fair, Mr. Chairman, before I get to my statement, remember, we've had whatever modifications you did in negotiation inside of Democrat, we've had an hour to look at these bills, an hour. They've not gone through regular order for the most part. And so to have some skepticism, I think, is appropriate given the fact that we weren't involved in the process. This was an internal Democratic negotiation to placate people that have been hostile to the police. It's just that simple. And that's why this didn't come up in July. So bear with us. I think we'll look at each bill individually. I think our members will do that. I think there'll be some support in some areas, others where they may not like the modifications that were made to placate some of the more extreme elements in your own caucus. While we're considering these bills, Mr. Chairman, under an emergency designation, it seems to me the only emergency is that the election's 48 days away. And Democrats have spent the past 2 years taking the very unpopular position of attacking men and women in law enforcement. Our communities are less safe because of Democratic policies at the municipal level. Our law enforcement morale, recruitment, and retention have all declined because of Democratic policies. There's nothing, nothing that my colleagues can say or do here today that will undo the damage that defund police rhetoric has inflicted. I hope this is a turning point for my friends on the other side, and I hope we can work together on a more bipartisan public safety measures in the future. And I applaud the members who have been working to find a path forward for these measures today. A lot of them have done so in good faith. But meeting under an emergency designation with no meaningful opportunity to review the changes to the legislation says more about polling than it does about anything else. Now, Ms. Jackson-Lee has been famous for being supportive of law enforcement for many years, and I thank her for being here today. And I do support some of these measures. And I hope the willingness to support our law enforcement doesn't stop with these bills. I'd like just to ask my friend from Texas a question, and you may not be able to answer it, but are you familiar with Congressman Rutherford's Protect and Serve Act? It's H.R. 3079. It's a bipartisan bill that creates federal penalties for individuals who deliberately target law enforcement officers with violence. Something I think everybody up here on both sides of the aisle would abhor. When Republicans were in the majority, we actually passed that legislation with very broad bipartisan support. So it's there. I think worthy of being included in this. But I'll ask my friend if she's had an opportunity to review that legislation.
We are, how should I say it? It is in the committee. We've had conversations with police groups and civil rights groups, and I would say that legislation is under review.
I appreciate that, and just for the record, it's worth noting it has 89 co-sponsors, including a number of my Democratic colleagues. It's supported by all major law enforcement groups. Unfortunately, so far, the majority has not chosen to move that bill forward. So I take my friend at her word, and I would hope you look at it. Let me ask a second piece of legislation. I'd like to draw your attention, if I may, to H.R. 3080, the Back the Blue Act, introduced by Congressman Bacon. It provides important new tools for officers to protect themselves. Are you familiar with that by any chance?
I am, and let me just say to the ranking member, since we are recognizing that we are all committed to the safety of our communities, that too is under review. We're familiar with Mr. Bacon's legislation, and no door has been closed, particularly when we're facing this mountain of deaths through guns and mountain of homicides throughout our nation.
Well, I appreciate that from my friend. It's also supported, I might note for the record, by many law enforcement groups. And again, unfortunately, so far it's not been considered, and the majority's refused to move. So again, I hope you will. I think, honestly, if there had been in this package either of these two pieces of legislation, that would have been very helpful, I think, in reassuring. And again, both these measures have serious bipartisan support. So I hope going forward, we don't just move Democratic bills forward, but since this is a bipartisan measure you're asking for, and in some areas I'm sure will receive bipartisan support, please take a look when you can at these measures. And with that,
If I might,
I'd certainly, absolutely.
if I might indicate that we have a common theme, and that is to be able to support good policing. These bills have a sort of an array of issues. They include personnel outside of policing to add to what policing do, and I think makes law enforcement better. And so the Victim Act in particular is a way to clear and to respond to victims whose loved ones have been the victims of violent crime and rape and assaults, and these have not been solved. And so the Victims Act is in particular supported by the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Fraternal Order of Police. All of us know that is the huge umbrella of police throughout America, rural and urban. And I'd ask unanimous consent to place these in the record.
Without objection.
And that is the Victims Act. And then I want to make sure that the Horsford bill that truly can break the cycle of violence, H.R. 5768, is actually asking the Department of Labor to award $1.5 billion in workforce development grants for youth in communities that are disproportionately impacted by violence, and directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to provide $5 billion in grants for community violence intervention programs over 8 years. And it is based on best evidence, and we've seen the results. of jobs, intervention with youth, and the whole idea of trying to work to intervene on the steeping tide of violence that plagues small, large, local, urban communities all over America.
Well, again, I always take my friend at her word, and she's a serious legislator. I will say this, though, again, it'd been a lot easier if this all hadn't been negotiated inside the Democratic caucus, and we had more than a single hour to review the changes. Now, I know what was in the bills in July. I don't know what's in them today. I'll have time, hopefully overnight, to take a look at it, but and so I certainly hope there's some of these bills I could support. I expect that there are, quite frankly, and I want to do that. But I'm going to lodge a pretty strong protest to the message when you take law enforcement, which is usually a bipartisan issue, and the entire negotiation is held within your caucus and not between us. We don't have an opportunity to have markups, hearing, or whatever. And that's been going on from July, August, most of September. And we're given an hour's notice, then expecting bipartisan support is a stretch. So again, this is a matter we can work together on. We have worked together on in the past. I don't think we've had a good faith effort to do that in this case, but I'm still hopeful there's some of these items I can support. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
If I might, Mr.
So,
Chairman,
certainly.
the Victims Act did go through regular order, and I think portions of Mr. Horsch's bill has been vetted by Republicans and Democrats as evidenced by its consideration in the United States Senate. So
I appreciate that, but I think as my friend Mr. Tiffany pointed out, if you would like to respond, I didn't mean to not give you an opportunity.
It's wonderful that the Republicans in the United States Senate had a chance to look at this in the Judiciary Committee. It'd be nice if the House Republicans would have been afforded the same opportunity in the Judiciary Committee.
Totally agree with your point, and thank you for making it. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Lee, for being here. I have a few questions, and I hope, I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson Lee. I have a few questions. I hope that you're able to provide me with some feedback on this as we move forward, as we move these bills to the floor. I was in local government. I also served in the state government. But I was also an 911 dispatcher for 17 and a half years, working for the Los Angeles Police Department. Every single day that I went to work, I listened to victims of crime. You can't say that people that live in communities like the community that I choose to live in, or people that work for a living listening to victims of crime don't care about law enforcement or don't care about public safety. That is just so radical. That is such a radical statement to me. It's incomprehensive, insulting to say the least. But here we are. I wish that instead of having this debate about funding or defunding the police, which these bills actually fund the police, we could have had this conversation when we were voting on the tax scam bill that put millions of dollars into the pockets of, the top 3% and 1% of U.S. citizens instead of helping our communities thrive. One of my questions on these bills, for H.R. 8542, I am concerned at one of the points here that the Secretary may revoke a grant if based on reporting or other information the activities funded through the grant are leading to a significant increase in incarceration or institutionalization. It's the institutionalization that highly concerns me. During the Reagan years, unfortunately, we did away with mental health institutions because our goal then was to have people with mental health issues live in communities, in group homes, versus sending them to an institution. And while I can support that, I think we have failed miserably in building the number of group homes that needed to be built in order to accommodate a growing number of people that are mentally unstable due to just health issues or drug issues. So that's a big concern I hope that we could address, if not as the bill moves forward, but in future legislation, and I would love to have an opportunity to work with you to address that. The other big concern that I have, and I know that in order, there's a middle ground for everything, and I don't feel like it's my way or the highway on these bills are much too important. I truly believe that having a cop at every corner does not necessarily make a community safer. Having, the programs to help grow a community into a safer community and to allow for youth to be able to thrive and be busy with healthy activities versus pushing them into the arms of the gangs or the drug dealers in their communities. So I'm very concerned about dropping the number on let me see, which bill is this? Sorry, I'm trying to get the bill number here. But what is it? 8542? HR 8542. The bill was written for cities with less than 200 police officers, and it was negotiated down to cities of 128 officers or less. That is a huge concern because that, if per capita, per 1,000 residents, the national average or the suggested average is that we have 2.4 officers for every 1,000 residents. If we go by that formula, only cities with like 53,000 residents would qualify for that, for that funding. That isn't good enough. That isn't going to help my communities, not all of them. It might help one or two, but it's not going to help all of them. It's certainly not going to help my home city. So I think that that is something that needs to be looked at. I wish that every member of Congress had a ring alarm, and this is not a commercial for the ring alarm, but it is how neighbors report crime that sometimes goes unreported to the police department. And you only have to sit there and read, and see the videos of crimes being committed in communities to understand how serious the homelessness issue has become as it relates to the lack of affordable housing that has been built in our communities as a result of Republican members of Congress who have failed to prioritize good housing bills and continue to offset the cost of providing community support to give that money to their funders. So can you address some of my concerns?
Well, first of all, Congresswoman Torres, we are always eager to hear the insight and expertise that you have, having spent 9 years dealing with 911 and hearing firsthand the absolute panic of victims and the intense work that law enforcement officers of all levels do. Texas is an interesting state. We have constables, we have deputy sheriffs, we have police, metro police, when I say police, city police, sheriffs, metro police that are transit. So I'm sure other jurisdictions have law enforcement and school police in many different ways, and we've certainly seen some tragedies there. So I would say that these collective bills are the first step toward where you are going. The number that originally was in the legislation, which is in fact HR 6448, covered 97% or a very high percentage of the 18,000 police departments in America. So we, in actuality, by the number 125, is a start. And the bill that will step in, that will have a future review, is the Cops on the Beat authorization, which may address, which is not before us today, but is a bill that has been introduced and will address those areas that, in fact, are larger than the 125. So it was thought that in order to get and be able to have enough resources for the real baby departments where people are suffering with one police officer, two, that we would be able to be effective in that manner.
We
Yeah.
want, you know, police officers to be able to do their job and be crime prevention and crime solvers. We don't want our police departments to be call chasers. And when a community doesn't have a big enough of a tax base to be able to support public safety. For my home city, it's not that we don't want to fund the police. 75% of the city's budget goes to public safety. So, you know, it's not a defunding a choice mechanism. It's the fact that there isn't enough resources. So when we say we're going to limit that at 128, our officers are always going to be call chasers. You know, I don't want somebody to come to my house and fill out a report, you know, for an incident that already happened. I want somebody to come and try to prevent an incident from happening.
I think you will find the collective body of bills that we have before us are going to answer your question. What we found in the evidence-based research is that 95%, I had a different number, 95% of departments are covered by the 125 number. And as I said, there's other legislation that will help supplement police officers that is pending in the Congress at this time. But what we're moving is the outcry that we heard from very, very small cities, which represent, in urban areas, rural areas, which represent 95% of police departments. Some have as low as 5, some as low as 10, and maybe only as high as 50. So if you would bear with us as we have other legislation pending that responds to your concern, I can assure you that helping all communities is a priority for us. Let me also say that you mentioned the issue dealing with mental health. That is legislation that is not in our jurisdiction, but I embrace your concerns that we should be, when it comes to mental health, we should be as expansive as we possibly can. And again, I think the package that we're putting before the members is a beginning. There is much pain in mental health. Everyone knows that.
I know there's a lot of pain in mental health, but and I'm not opposed at all. I fully support having mental health units respond with officers. That was like a pilot program when I was a 911 dispatcher back in 2005 in Los Angeles. They did a great job trying to create this program to have officers respond to mental health calls. More mental health needs to be available. Resources, they need to be available before people come into crisis. You know, by the time a mother calls 911 because their addicted son or daughter has broken all the windows in the home, right? Or is almost too late. That person's going to be institutionalized. That's why that concern for me is a problem. When that child or that young person is acting out in school, that's when we need to prevent and provide mental health health care for them to prevent them from becoming the violent person. So there's a lot of work on this. I know that these bills are not going to fix the entire problem. I get that. I just want you to know that those are some of my concerns that I have that I hope that we can work moving forward. The other issue is officers don't just need a uniform, and protective gear, and training on how to utilize that gear. Officers also need mental health help. We expect them in some cities to go from one terrible incident to another, to another, to another. And then we expect them to go home and be that gentleman of a husband and loving father. In between that, there has to be a way for them to be able to talk about, these terrible incidents that they have had to confront. And I think that that is another piece that is missing here. I introduced an amendment. I understand it's late, but I still introduced it because I wanted to have an opportunity for us to talk about that. The bill does provide for some of that.
Let me, just getting just a mountain of information. The one thing I want to do is to make sure that we acknowledge that the breaking this cycle of violence is one of the components of this package. It can be used for a myriad of things. One, in training persons that are dealing with mental health crisis, when I say training persons to deal with mental health crisis in the arena of violence, and to really get that young person or that person who may be on the road to breaking glass or to be intimidating in the family, and the family loves them, and the only relief they have is calling the police, which jeopardizes them as well.
Only because it's open 24/7.
That's all the time. So I think that bill, along with the $5 billion in it, to deal specifically with community programs that communities can use to particularly target those who are suffering from mental health issues and crisis before they get to a crisis, because it comes on the fire and it comes on the police. The other thing is, in the bill dealing with Investor Protect, we made sure that there is just precise language providing access to patient-centered behavioral health services for law enforcement, which may include resources for risk assessment, evidence-based trauma-informed care, which I think is very important. On page 6, care to treat post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder, peer support and counsel services, and family support, and the promotion of improved access to high-quality mental health care through telehealth. We wanted to open the door for law enforcement to feel safe in seeking whatever makes them comfortable, some way to address the stress. I am here in Washington, and a husband went missing in my district. Unfortunately, whatever his circumstance was, he wound up dead by way of gun violence or homicide, but he had a 2-year-old in the car. And he was found one place, and only when the mother called 911 and the police said, "My husband and baby are missing." Tragically, that baby was found in that car seat dead. It preys on my mind because I could connect it to my feeling. What about the police officers? The chief said, "Pray for the family," because I know he felt it. And so we want to make sure that we do have resources for police, and I think throughout these bills you will see that we are concerned and we embrace the concerns that you have.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add?
I'll pass for now.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. And before you go, let me just say that there'll be a vote shortly, and I think there's only one vote, and so we'll keep it going, all right? We'll figure out a way to make sure you guys get the vote, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I'm sorry that we're meeting here under such short notice. I guess there's not many amendments that have been offered, and perhaps that's by design. Let me just ask you, Mr. Tiffany, you're on the Judiciary Committee. One of the bills that we have before us, H.R. 8542, the Justice and Policing Act, to send trained social workers to the site of a crime or where aid has been requested. This bill was actually referred to the Energy and Commerce Committee, but we didn't ever do anything with it, unfortunately. But this strikes me as a method that is perhaps, well, number one, I think it's going to be unsatisfactory, but two, I think it might be dangerous to the people involved. You can just imagine, I don't know that we've talked to prosecutors and law enforcement about this bill, about what they think about how this bill will work. You worry that the first call you get that night at 11 or 12 o'clock at night is going to be for assistance, and the next call you get at 3 or 4 in the morning will be for retrieval of the remains, because it is, these are conflicts that are fraught with peril, and to send a social worker into these very volatile family situations just strikes me as inherently unsafe. So we didn't have any opportunity, Energy and Commerce, to talk about this. Did you talk about it in the Judiciary Committee?
No. And I would throw out another phrase that was used here in a separate bill, violence interrupters. We used to call them police. And as the defund the police movement has grown, now people want to create some other means of protecting people to protect victims and potential victims. And it's not going to work. I mean, to me, ultimately, what this is about is, this is the arrogance of sitting in Washington, D.C.
Yes, sir.
And saying that we're going to be able to fix these problems in communities across America. This is a state function. That's where this should happen. And the states are awash with money. I think about our state of Wisconsin, $5 billion surplus. And the gubernatorial candidates in an election year are talking about how they're going to help public safety with that. I mean, the arrogance that we are going to fix this and that a federal bureaucrat is going to administer a program and they're going to make it better, it's doomed to failure.
It's doomed to failure, and we're going to get people killed. We are going to get people killed by this type of thinking out of Washington, D.C., that we can handle things at the street level in communities across the country, in Wisconsin, with Texas, and points in between. I'm just so offended that this bill has come to the Rules Committee so quickly, without the proper input from the committees of jurisdiction. I think it is dangerous type of thinking, and Mr. Chairman, I just regret very much that we are hearing this bill under these circumstances. Yes, Mr. Tiffany.
Yes, if I may comment. Coming from a state legislature, I served in the state legislature in Wisconsin for nearly 10 years. It is stunning to me in the first 2 years of office here to see how the committee process and the process in the House of Representatives of having a deliberative process is completely broken down. It's stunning to watch it happen.
And the byproduct of that is we are creating conditions that are dangerous on the ground for our law enforcement and even for our social workers who were requesting to go into this situation with these very volatile individuals. So thank you for coming here today on short notice. I wish it hadn't worked out like this. I wish we had had a chance to really talk this through and hear from experts on this. Mr. Chairman, I think we're making a grave mistake with this bill, but I'll yield back.
May I make a brief observation, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, okay. Doctor, you want to yield, Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Yes.
Okay.
That particular legislation is not in the jurisdiction of judiciary, but I would offer to say that none of us doubt that the way it's formulated, law enforcement will make very informed decisions, as they typically do when non-police come. They are very astute about where and how these non-police persons are, and I don't have a doubt or a fear that there's going to be a surge and a run on a crime scene or a scene before the crime, maybe in the tenseness of a standoff or a SWAT situation.
Well,
that they
reclaiming
will
my
send someone
time,
in.
I do have those concerns. This is a shared bill between Energy and Commerce and Judiciary, according to the copy of the bill that I have. I know we didn't get an opportunity to look at it in Energy and Commerce. We didn't get a chance to hear from any experts. Inherently, I think this is a very dangerous legislative product, and it should not go forward. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, and let me just say a couple of things. One is, as I'm looking at these bills, most of these are grant programs. So it's not a mandate that states have to take advantage of this. I mean, number one. So I mean, the idea that, you know, we're forcing states to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, these are grant programs. States have the ability to want to utilize these or not. Number one, and number two, look, we're at the end of the session, and sometimes at the end of the session we move things quickly under emergency procedures. I would just say that the last time my friends were in charge, toward the end of the session, the bill that you brought before us under emergency procedures was a bill dealing with cheese. I think, you know, this seems to me to be more important than cheese. So,
Well, Mr.
Chairman,
Chairman,
you-
coming from Wisconsin,
I know. I'm
mean,
sorry.
that's a whole nother issue.
I should have realized that before I went down that road. So I apologize. Yeah. All
For
right.
the record, I voted against that cheese bill.
Okay. So he voted against the cheese bill. So I mean, Mr. Perl-
Duly noted, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Got it. Well, it was under the Twizzlers, sorry about that. So, I guess, the Bill 5768, the Victim Act, Ms. Jackson Lee's, and Ms. Tiffany, I served in our state legislature for a long time, 8 years in the Colorado State Senate. One of the areas that we had a lot of problems were on some cold cases, Ms. Jackson Lee, and particularly Native Americans we seem to have a lot of cold cases where we needed to bring them to closure, to add some resources to help them and help figure out those cases. So tell me how you see the Victim Act improving clearance rates for homicides of all peoples, but you know, for me, I just remember specifically from the Judiciary Committee in Colorado, that was one where we really needed to make improvements.
Thank you very much, Congressman Perlmutter, and I really want to make an observation. I'm sorry Dr. Burgess is gone and is focusing on what states can do. States need help, and it is clear they do. I just want to recite these numbers again. Gun violence costs this country over $280 billion every year. That means that people are being shot and wounded and are dying. States can't get control of that. And as well, people are suffering with $448,000 in medical care, and fatality costs to taxpayers are $270,399. This is to give help to communities, and particularly our indigenous, Native Americans. Many of us know the conditions on either the Pueblos or the reservation. We've tried to fix it, but we've had people commit crime on these jurisdictions and run off to be never apprehended. This gives the ability of local jurisdiction law enforcement who care and who opt into these programs to be able to go back to provide care and comfort to families by finding out about the rape, the assault, the homicide, the robbery, the violence. And if you've ever spoken to victims, many of us have provided community project money to help police officers deal with the victims of crime. They're so appreciative because they feel so alone. And in the instance of Native Americans, even more so, because these things have happened in eras when there was not that much attention. So I think to be able to provide a direct pipeline of resources to be able to go back over those cold cases would help indigenous populations, people of color, women, poor people, where sometimes the cases, because of lack of resources or size of the department or expertise have not been able to be solved.
Thank you. So, Mr. Tiffany, you said you opposed all of them. And maybe you were just doing a broad brush across them, but this is a grant program to assist clearing cold cases, or things that haven't been solved. Please tell me, do you oppose this one?
I agree with the concept of you want to clear cold cases, but I would go back to, we see states with significant surpluses, including in the state of Wisconsin. If this is a big concern for them, then they should fund that appropriately and make sure that gets done. Now, in regards to Native American tribes, I have 8 of them in my district. And if there's more funding that's needed for the Native American tribes, then let's do a bill for the Native American tribes.
And I appreciate your comment about the $5 billion, and I don't know about Wisconsin, but I know Michigan has a surplus and others. I mean, that surplus isn't because of any great things that Wisconsin did. It's because they kept the money that we sent to them under the Rescue Plan and the CARES Act. So at some point, and you were, I guess my point being, these are federal funds that they're holding in surplus. Whether that makes any difference as to how they're ultimately used, which is sort of your point. They got the money, they don't need more. I mean, that's what you're saying, regardless of where it came from. Is that pretty much a fair statement?
Yeah, there are states that, the reason they have such a surplus is because of all the federal dollars that have been a gusher into their states.
Right, and they haven't spent it for one reason or another. But I guess I'm having trouble with your opposition to a grant program to clear cold cases. And, they don't have to apply for the grants if they don't want the damn grant. So I guess I'm having trouble with the opposition. I do have a less than friendly question for you, Ms. Jackson Lee, which is HR 6448, Invest to Protect Act. Originally, that was 200. That was communities of 200, where there were 200 police. Now it's down to 125. I don't think that really helps my jurisdictions much. And I'm just curious, what was the reason to drop it from 200 to 125?
The thinking behind the 125 is that covers at least 90 to 95% of departments, that there is pending legislation that deals with ones above 126, 130, 150 in the cops on the beat. That would require more deliberation and analysis. That is pending. It's not moving yet, but it is a pending bill that we're all aware of. We thought that we'd get the crux of the heart of agencies that are 10 and 50, 1 and 2, and there are many of them. Wanted to make sure that we had the resources to cover those entities who are particularly desperate in terms of not even to replenish and or to keep these officers because they don't have the resources to pay them competitive rates. And we wanted to make sure.
If I were to offer an amendment to raise it to 200, would you consider that a friendly or unfriendly amendment?
Maybe
You can think about it while I go vote. Okay.
maybe unfriendly, but you are friendly, and that's
I
what
yield
counts.
back to the chair. We ought to allow our witnesses to go vote.
We're watching the clock. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. It's good to see the witnesses here today. Representative Tiffany, it's my understanding that under the Victims Act, Democrat-run localities that defund the police are eligible to receive federal funding to clean up their messes. Do you think this is an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars?
It is not. So you have all these cities that chose to defund the police, and now they're coming in with their hands out, wanting to get additional funding. And we actually provided an amendment in committee that was voted against by all Democrats. All Democrats rejected an amendment which said that if you chose to defund the police, then you are not eligible for this. So the cities that made a bad decision, you heard in my opening testimony, New York City, Los Angeles, places like that, that made a bad decision, now we reward them for their bad behavior.
Yeah, and just to put some context to that too, Representative Tiffany, I mean, this is not something that we're just making up. If you look back at 2020, like you said, LA cut $150 million out of its police budget. Portland, $25 million cut. Seattle cut $7 million. New York City was the highest at $1 billion cut, and Chicago, $80 million cut from their budget. So it's absolutely hypocritical that in one year, Democrat-run cities are defunding their police departments. The next year, they're asking us to give them extra funding for their police. So I don't think that's lost on anybody. But, yes.
May I add a comment, Mr. Eschenthaler? And who's going to pay for that now? It is the communities that chose to keep their public services like their police funded. Now, they're going to end up paying for this. It's a little bit like the student loan forgiveness program. Those who are responsible are now ending up toting the bill on that also.
Thanks, Mr. Tiffany. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon?
I'm really happy that we're able to move this policing and public safety package forward, particularly as it includes several programs that law enforcement agencies in my district have told me that they want to implement in order to improve safety and reduce violence in our region. And I would urge our Republican colleagues to support these bills, although they seem more interested in taking the old position that crime is bad without being able to support ways to change that's happening. So there are three programs in this package that are really important for my district. First, I'm really proud that the package contains one of my bills, the Mental Health Justice Act, which provides funding to hire and train mental health providers to staff first responder units and be deployed as appropriate. Time and time again, we've seen tragic interactions between individuals suffering from a mental health crisis and police officers who lack the resources to handle those situations. One such tragedy involved the killing of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia in 2020. And we've heard from Delaware County, which forms the bulk of my district, that the top item on its wish list last year was for the type of mobile mental health unit that could be dispatched with the funding in this bill. We're very grateful that Congress chose to fund the mental health unit for Delaware County through a community project financing grant this year. But having trained mental health professionals to respond to appropriate 911 calls is going to help prevent such tragedies in the future. Second, I'm pleased that we're moving forward with the Victim Act, which I co-sponsored with my colleague Val Demings, the former chief of police from Orlando, Florida. The Victim Act provides additional resources to assist law enforcement to solve gun crimes, which have been surging across the country since the start of the pandemic. And in fact, the Philadelphia Police Department has requested exactly this type of assistance to support the special unit it implemented in February of this year to improve its low clearance on gun violence cases. And third, the Invest to Protect Act is going to provide grants to help fund recruitment, retention, and training of police officers. This is particularly important to my district, where most of the communities rely upon small community police forces. And one of their greatest challenges in recent years has been having the funding to enable these departments to achieve accreditation and training that allows their forces to be up to date in modern policing tactics. Just this Sunday, I was stopped by one of our police chiefs and asked if we could help him find funding to get his department accredited. And in the paper this week, we saw the first of our local boroughs achieve accreditation. So this is going to be a huge help for law enforcement in my region. The package today will provide grants to support small police departments, help victims affected by violent crime, and fund development efforts in underserved areas. So I look forward to supporting these bills in the House. I did have one question for Ms. Jackson-Lee, but I know she had to go to vote, so perhaps I can ask it when she returns. I would yield back.
You didn't want me to answer it in her stead?
Do you want to wait for Mr. Jackson Lee before you ask your questions? Okay, can we go to Ms. Fishbach and we'll just, okay. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I don't have a lot of questions since we don't have a lot, we didn't have a lot of time to prepare because it was, what, an hour, hour and a half, whatever we had. But I just did want to point out that there is, and I don't know, given that we've all been kind of in and out because and judiciary is going on and we had votes on the floor and this was, a hastily called meeting. I did want to point out, did we talk at all about the kinds of money that's being spent in this bill? That, you take a look, or in these bills, I guess, 6.5 billion in one of the bills and just a new department being created. And I don't think we're even looking at that kind of thing. So, obviously,
Ms. Fishbach, may I comment
Yep.
on that? I think it's one of the things that's not being talked about in this hearing also is, once again, the inflationary impact of more federal spending where you have borrowed money that is going out the door, and this is going to hit the American people once again. It is really stunning to me that when you see persistent inflation at this point, it's clear it's going to be with us for a significant amount of time. I think the Federal Reserve just announced today they went up 0.75 of a point, which is going to really begin to put the brakes on the economy, and it's going to create real problems. Remember, the thing that always follows inflation is unemployment. So watch out for what is coming. But I don't know why we would continue to spend money that we don't have with a $30 trillion debt. Not only should this be a state issue, and this arrogance that the federal government is going to fix this problem because it's not from the federal government level, but it's going to be inflationary also. It continues to make it worse, even as we see the flashing red light is going brightly.
Well, and I appreciate that, and it concerns me even more that at least one of the bills that I'm just taking a look at that does spend the 6.5 billion wasn't marked up in judiciary. We're not looking at these things. We're not talking about things. There's no input from the minority. The majority isn't willing to have the discussions to talk about these things and potentially come up with good ideas. And it's just disappointing. I know that the majority talks about just the other bill we had the other day. We've had so many rules meetings this week. I forget which. Loan separation. Yes, there you go. That they were so disappointed that the minority wasn't supporting it. I continue to be disappointed by the majority because they don't allow for any kinds of discussion. I mean, this is time and time and time again, and the police are an important part of our government, and it's once again disappointing that the input isn't there. And Mr. Tiffany?
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on your remarks there, Mrs. Fishbach. I think more than money, what law enforcement and police across America need to hear is that you have our support to do your job. Now, when you don't do your job appropriately, then we're going to intervene. And I think about the little town that I'm from, where they have taken appropriate action, where there have been policemen that did not do their jobs appropriately, and there was inappropriate behavior. But that is the small minority of law enforcement officers that are out there. If people don't start talking about, we support you, even in tough situations, because they get put in the toughest situations in society. They are not hearing that at this point. And in particular, from a subset of your party, they continue to not hear that support. And that subset of people I'm referring to are in the big cities that we're referencing here.
Well, and Mr. Cole mentioned several Republican bills, and the answer was, oh, well, they're in judiciary, we're looking at them, but they haven't been heard in judiciary. And I've got bills that haven't been heard. And it's just that kind of don't take any input from the minority. Whatever the minority does is bad. And it's just disappointing. And I think that Mr. Tiffany had a good point that what the police need is to hear that that we support them, and I think that's bipartisan. I think they would appreciate us getting together, the majority would take some input from the minority, and we would come up with something that we could, that people could support, that all of us could support. But, and with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Mr. Divvy, why don't you go vote and come back, and Ms. Jackson-Lee, I don't know, did you hear Ms. Scanlon's questions, or?
I did have one question with respect to the Invest to Protect Act. I don't have the problem that Mr. Perlmutter does with the size of the police force because most of the 57 some odd police forces in my region are quite small. But one of the things that I hear from them on basically a weekly basis is they don't have the funding they need to get accredited, to do the training, to, get accredited in 21st century policing tactics. So are the funds in the Invest to Protect Act available to help pay for accreditation?
Well, the funds in the Invest Act are funds for training, and
Yep.
training contributes to accreditation.
Okay.
And there is such a level of funding for de-escalation, duty to care, all of that contribute to the new scheme, the new schedule, if you will, of accreditation. So I think your small cities will have a double plus. One, they can hire and pay for officers, and they can seek to retain them. All they have to do is report on how they use the bonus process in that federal dollars. And I know that's very important. To bring young officers in, you want to entice them to say, this is a good place to be, and in fact, we have the ability to give you a bonus. And then they can put in place training processes and submit those as part of their seeking the accreditation. And I think the accreditation is just crucial, which is one of the things we try to do with the Law Enforcement and Trust Integrity Act as part of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Many people look to one aspect of George Floyd. It had a myriad of really support systems for police officers, including mental health and tools and funding for sophisticated equipment, and unfortunately, it was skewed in a different way. And would you, if you have a question, but I just want to make an observation, but I'll wait on.
No, that was really it. It's something that's top of mind because I've had so many inquiries about where they can find, where our local forces can find that funding, that it would be lovely to be able to tell them, yes, this is something we're doing here.
And you can opt in, and, it's, who knows, there may be less opting in and more resources for those who do and more guidance for those who do as well. Mr. Chairman, I just choose to make an observation because it's just been a back and forth with, I think, wrong numbers. The Judiciary Committee deals with this all the time. We want what is best for America. And I think our friends need to know that Republican-run cities and states continue to experience higher per capita homicide rates. In 2020, per capita murder rates were 40% higher in states won by the incumbent, Donald Trump, than those won by President Joe Biden. If this is the discussion we're going to have, 8 of the 10 states with the highest murder rates in 2020 voted for the Republican presidential nominee in every election this century. Homicide rates in rural America rose 25% in 2020, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And cities have found that there are cities that have 175 murders compared to a more progressive city of a similar size. And in 2020, Oklahoma City and Tulsa had homicide rates of 11.16 and 19.64 out of 100,000, while New York had a rate of 5.94. We don't get anywhere when we juxtapose cities based on what their inclination is. And this battering that my friends have been engaged in is offensive. It's particularly offensive as it relates to the Judiciary Committee and our judicial and our responsibility to deal with law enforcement. I've dealt with law enforcement for the 27 years that I've been here. And I think we have responded to both their needs and their pain. Just to say, Lexington, Kentucky had a record homicides in 2020 and 2021 with a murder rate of 10.61, twice the size of New York City. Bakersfield and Fresno each have Republican mayors and murder rates far higher than San Francisco, Los Angeles. So, large cities that have been spoken about so distortedly, with Democratic mayors spend far more money on policing and hire far more police officers than large cities. Republican mayors, and the 25 largest Democratic-run cities employ 75% more police officers than the 25 largest Republican-run cities on a per capita basis. And the 25 largest Democrat-run cities spend 35% or 38% more on policing than the 25 largest Republican-run cities on a per capita basis. I think the point is, we gain nothing by juxtaposing X and Y, X and Y. What we need to do is come together. These bills bring people together in a myriad of ways, provide resources to our local communities.
Thank you.
I thank you for allowing me to make an observation.
May I comment?
Yes, will you yield to Mr.
May I
Tiffany?
comment?
Yeah, yes.
I would just hone in on the term battering. If you want to see the term battering in play, just go to cities across America, and it's spilling out from outside the cities to suburbs and the rest of America also at this point. The battering that's being taken is the victims of crime in America.
That's why you should be happy to support these bills.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli? All right, Mr. Desaulniers, all set? Ms. Ross?
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, first I would like to introduce, with the Chair's indulgence, to the Rules Committee, Councilmember Steve Rao from the town of Morrisville, North Carolina. He's the first Indian-American elected official in the state of North Carolina.
Wow.
And he has held this position for 10 years, more than 10 years? 12 years, and he's here with the city's groups that are coming from all over the country. And to the point, for some of our towns, I represent 10 municipalities in Wake County, North Carolina, and I regularly talk to my police chiefs. And the two things that they want the most assistance with and grant programs from the government for are mental health issues, mental health funding for law enforcement, and gun violence prevention. And then for my county, their largest priority has been their own DNA testing lab so that they can deal with unsolved cases. And thanks to community project funding, I got them money for that DNA testing lab. I believe that these bills address precisely what local law enforcement is asking for. I have regular conversations, not just with them, but with local elected officials. And to the extent that we can help finance these very, very important programs, our local tax dollars can go to increasing the salaries of our law enforcement. And in a growing area like Wake County, where the salaries of law enforcement do not keep up with the salaries of the tech industry, I would like to be able to give that kind of relief to the local governments I represent. I support these bills, I support the rule, and I commend them to the body, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. And everyone here has voted, right? Okay, all right, good. Anybody else have any questions? Hearing none, I want to thank both of you for being here today and for your testimony and answering our questions. You are free to go.
Thank you for your courtesies to all of the members of the Rules Committee. Thank you.
Is there any other member that wishes to testify on H.R. 8542, 4118, 5768, 6448?
Who's managing?
Seeing none, that closes the hearing. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Mrs. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4118, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5768, the Victim Act of 2022 under a closed rule. The rule provides 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee, print 117-62, modified by the amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 6448, the Invest to Protect Act of 2022 under a closed rule. The rule provides 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee, print 117-65, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 8542, the Mental Health Justice Act of 2022, under a closed rule. The rule provides 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. And finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from California. And before I ask if there's any amendment or discussion, I just want to again wish, in a bipartisan way, Laurie Ismail's happy birthday and Jennifer Belair's birthday. So we have two birthdays today. I can't think of a better gift than sitting in the Rules Committee. Twice today.
Without a cake.
Yeah, no cake. But, yeah, anyway. So, having said that, is there any amendment or discussion? Ms. Fishbach?
Mr. Chair, before I do that, I have to mention that on Monday, and I didn't mention it, but it was Nick's birthday on Monday.
Nick, happy birthday.
And I will probably never, he ducked down. He ducked down because I knew I was going to say, he knew I was
We have
going
a
to say
rule for every
something.
birthday.
Yeah, there you go. But, Mr. Chair, I do have an amendment. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add a section to the rule providing for consideration of my bill, H.R. 7421, the Law Enforcement Education Grant Program Act of 2022, under a closed rule. Mr. Chair, H.R. 7421 provides educational grants to encourage young men and women to pursue a career in law enforcement. As we consider the number of police bills before us today, it is important that we include the critical legislation to invest in the future of our law enforcement by providing for an educated police force dedicated to keeping our communities safe. As recruitment efforts lag, Congress must send the message that we value our law enforcement officers rather than perpetuating disturbing trends that aim to disparage law enforcement. I urge the adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
You heard the gentlelady's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agree to further amendments. If not, the vote is on the motion for the gentleman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross? Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Rosenthaler? Mr. Rosenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to, and I will carry it for the Democrats. Without objection, the committee is adjourned, and hopefully we won't see you again this week. All right? Not that I, not